Hey, it's Pedram. Welcome back. You might have listened to the interview with Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann from last week. I had accelerated the release of that given what had happened in Paris and Kenya and Beirut last week, and it was a conversation about what was happening in Afghanistan. I brought him back to talk about Paris, talk about this current crisis that we're dealing with and what is happening around the world, how to deal with terrorism. Scott Mann, part 2. You don't want to miss this. It's important. Hey, I want to thank you for being back, man. Your interview that I had done with you, we had conducted it before this whole debacle in Paris. And so I decided to release it ahead of time just because I thought it was a very relevant conversation, and it definitely struck some chords with people in our audience and on the internet. And it's just, look, there's no conversation that we can have that isn't going to be difficult around this subject. It just sucks. So, you know, I really wanted to kind of pick up from there and talk about what happened in Paris, and let's talk about solutions, because we've had a lot of people poking around being like, oh yeah, it was all, you know, a 9/11 conspiracy, or the Israelis did it, or this person did it, or that person did it. And I'm not here to deny or argue that at all, and I don't think you're interested in that either. I think we're interested in moving forward and finding solutions. Yeah, we fucked up. Maybe we created ISIS. Maybe we messed up a lot of things. But how do we fix the world at this point, and what does that conversation look like?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, man. And you know, I really do wish it were under better circumstances. You know, frankly, I wish we were talking about what we said we were going to talk about the next time we were together, which was bringing our warriors home, right? I mean, that is something I'm equally passionate about. But unfortunately, you know, this stuff keeps happening, and I wish it were under better circumstances. But it is where we are, and I think it is the struggle of our time, man. I think we're up against it. It's not going away anytime soon. So I'm glad to have the conversation with you, and we'll jump in anywhere you want.
Yeah. Well, let's jump in in the softest, most sensitive, tender spot that, you know, is right in front of us right now, which is Paris, right? This thing happened. I mean, it stopped the world, and it showed how a little band of crazies can really make a huge impact if they don't care about their own life and they don't care about innocent lives. So, just I'd like to get your opinion on you know, that, you know, how that went down, potentially why that went down, and then let's get into finding a real solution. I mean, I don't think having guys with machine guns on every street corner and having a politicized military fascist state to defend us is the way any of us want to live. So, you know, then we can talk about how to fix this.
Yeah, so I think it's the right place to start, Pedram. And I would just say, let me just make a couple of observations for your viewers to chew on here. You know, the first one is, as a guy who spent, you know, most of my life, my adult life, in special ops, and a lot of that in combat, you know, as I watched the aftermath of these attacks, and I, you know, a couple of things strike me. One, these were immensely complex attacks in Paris. I mean, this was it was strategic surprise. That means the nation of France was caught off guard, and frankly, most of the Western world. B, it was, again, very complex, which implies a degree of synchronization when you are, you know, injecting this kind of violence anywhere in the world. It is very difficult to synchronize this level of violent application across, you know, that many locations and that many variables. It's very difficult to pull that off. So it was a very complex attack. They achieved strategic surprise. And, you know, what I keep coming back to on this is that I don't think we can ignore the fact that this attack emanated from inside those borders. In other words, you can't launch an attack of this scale just crossing the borders with a bunch of grenades and machine guns and then pulling back out. This has been planned for a while. I think what we'll learn is that there was an active auxiliary inside France. You know, I don't know how much of that was from like the refugee diaspora community or what, but I suspect what we're going to see is that there was at least some partial support from inside the country in forms of an auxiliary. And I just, you know, to me, that makes my hair stand on end. When I see this kind of complex attack that lasted for that long take place inside a modern nation state, it really gives me pause. And I almost feel like I'm in the kill zone of an ambush myself. That's what I'm feeling right now. Something about this really is ominous, and I think we had better step back and take notice of it.
Yeah, it gives you pause, and anyone in Paris, I think, or anyone in France was probably is probably still there, and the question, obviously becomes, should we be concerned? And there's been kind of headlines saying, there's no real imminent threat right now to the United States, but look, the world's become a complicated place, and there's been a lot of speculation that the terror networks have used this refugee crisis as an opportunity to drive militants into European countries by the thousands, and so these terror cells are now, getting, a lot of support from militarily trained bad guys that are now parking up in towns all over Europe and are waiting for orders. So, yeah, it's scary and it's really hectic. So, okay, as a military man, what would your response be to that prior to the kind of enlightenment that you had in your training in Afghanistan and realizing how you got to talk to people in villages? And then let's talk about, how we would do this, for humanity. Because I think the military response is always one of clamping down and getting the rifles out and looking at, where to whack-a-mole. And I think the lesson from our last video that we did together and some of these conversations that we've been having is that's not a long-term solution. So what would the military response be, and then what would our kind of more sophisticated response need to be to resolve this crisis?
Yeah, so great question. So let me just, put on my, kind of my military hat for a perspective for a second and address that, because there are some legitimate concerns I think you have to come at this when you're talking about a free society like France or a free society like we live in here in the United States, Pedram. That's one of the inherent risks that you have as a free society, is that threats can kind of come and go and move about unhindered in ways that they probably could not do, say, in Saudi Arabia or even Kuwait or some of those places that have or North Korea. You don't see this happening in North Korea. And so, for me, and I think for a lot of military folks as warriors, the first thing is we think is, okay, what does this mean to the United States? What does it mean to the freedom and more importantly, to the security of our people? And I think, first of all, there's a certain foreboding to this that I think we have to pay attention to. This is not a one-off. As a soldier, I believe it would be irresponsible to look at what happened in Paris and think that it's just isolated to Paris, or even that it's just isolated to Europe. I think it is a harbinger of what we can expect here in the United States if we don't change our foreign policy and if we don't approach national security from a different perspective. This is truly a clash of civilizations that's taking place right now. It manifested in Paris, but it will not be isolated to Paris.
Sure. And that's, I think that kind of feeds into the narrative of the militants, where this is a class of civilizations, and there's a dialogue out there right now about economic hardship, financial equality, access to resources, and a lot of things that the Middle East has kind of gotten screwed out of ever since the British and the French started carving that area up. And we talked about this in our last interview: tribal region, drawing nation-state lines, separating families and putting tyrants with an iron fist. That probably wasn't the best idea. It created a really terrible situation, and it's a hangover that we can't shake off, it seems. So. How do we start addressing that piece of it? Like, is the answer food, schools, shoes, and kind of responsible kind of civic action for all, or are these militants, are they a cancer that kind of feed off of the hatred that they're going to be there either way, and they're going to be a problem either way? So we have to kind of deal with it in two-pronged approach.
Yeah, I think maybe even more than two prongs, Pedram. I think, first of all, I do believe that these militants, particularly ISIS and Al Qaeda, and some of the more virulent strains of uh, Islamism, they are, for the most part, certainly at senior levels, irreconcilable. In other words, I don't think any amount of goodwill is going to change what they stand for, nor is it going to change their desire to project a global caliphate, an end of days scenario, and in your face, audacious, overt violence at every turn. We're going to have
that's their MO. That's who they are. That's
their MO, and you're not going to change that through good works. I just don't believe that, and that's just the pragmatist in me, having dealt with these guys for a very long time. So I think there's that we're going to have to go after these guys in some fashion. Here's the problem: is right now what we've been doing for the last 14 years, and France is doing it right now. We keep playing the same playbook. We keep trying to go after these guys in a top-down, frankly, Cold War kind of fashion. It kind of looks like total war, but it's really not. There's a lot of air power. There's a heavy footprint, and it kind of makes us feel better when it comes to retribution of what these guys do. So, these guys waltz in with a handful of extremists into Paris. They cause tremendous damage, and they kill a lot of people. And France retaliates with significant air power on some isolated training camps in Syria, and it gives this collective feel of retribution, and it demonstrates that the politicians are quote unquote doing something. But I caution about that. I think it's exactly what we did after 9/11, and like you said, I believe it plays directly into the narrative of what these violent extremists want, which is the narrative is Islam is under attack by the West, and it is the duty of every Muslim to defend it. And that narrative is reinforced when we go in with this kind of response. And because where are the bad guys, hiding out? They're hiding out in tribal communities. And so when these bombs fall, it's pretty easy for them to tell the story after the dust settles. And it just spins. It just becomes a cycle of recruiting for them. When we have a moment, there's a small portion of my book that I'd actually like to read that addresses this on how we respond. Just let me know when's a good time for that, and because I think it's very, very appropriate to what we're talking about.
Sure. Pull it out.
Okay.
And while you're pulling it, I got to say, the notion that we want retribution is it's such a masculine approach to problems that can use a little bit of kind of feminine touch, right? And so let's read your quote, and then let's talk about what the women of the world can bring to this as well. The women in these tribes, the women in these communities, because I'm just, everything here is like guys punching each other back in the face. And that if that would have worked, we would have been out of Afghanistan and Iraq, or that would have been resolved way differently. So let's take this segment from your book first before we go there.
Yeah. So this is from chapter 1 of the book, and I wrote this to basically caution against how we respond in the West to exactly what has just happened in Paris. And so I would just ask your readers. There's a few portions in here where I talk about Al Qaeda, but just think about it as ISIS, and you'll get the same thing. But it's entitled "Bait and Switch." There is one more component to the game. It's the sudden death period before the game is over. It's when emotions run high and tempers flare. It's where reactionary desperation to do something in the face of audacious violence upon our own people actually leads us to uninformed action, which would otherwise never be considered. It's at this point in the game when we get sucked in even deeper by our enemies, by design, and we must resist this with all our might. Violent extremists want us to mobilize against them. They need us as their enemy. Each terror attack, every beheading, pulls us deeper into this war. It's one of the biggest examples of a bait and switch in our history. Violent extremists cast us as the far Satan in order to mobilize their religious base toward a unified caliphate.
Attacking us at home, where it hurts most, guarantees the pissed off, callous enemy they crave. Our response to these imminent attacks will be predictable. Here's how the U.S. will respond, and I guess you can read France here, when, not if, we are attacked on a large scale by violent extremists again at home. The attack will come, it will be ugly. First, there will be collective shock and disbelief across the U.S. We will shake our heads and ask, how could this happen? Others will scream amidst the chaos, we must do something. As a way of doing something, hundreds of thousands of American flags will go out on balconies, porches, and stoops. We'll come together briefly. We will see these patriotic images contrasted with the utter destruction of the attack site, which is plastered across our television screens as we are glued to the 24-hour news cycle. Dismay will give way to anger. This anger will rise slowly like a phoenix. Nashville will produce stirring country music songs about the need to go kill the bastards who did this to us. Nationalism will swell to a crescendo as yellow ribbons decorate every oak tree on Main Street America. And then, almost on cue, the long formations of young military heroes will reappear. Tens of thousands of warriors with short cropped hair and determined faces will board aircraft to make the long flight across the ocean. The news outlets will capture every heartfelt moment of this road to war. This type of news content drives ratings through the roof. And then I'll fast forward just a little bit to what will actually happen. The fight will be epic. We'll lose hundreds. We'll kill tens of thousands. By all accounts, it will be a clear victory for the far superior American military. But violent extremists will carry the war as we once more walk right into the extremist narrative trap that was set for us. Islam is under attack by the West. Here is one quote that Osama bin Laden made shortly after 9/11 when we responded, and I'll end for your comment here, Pedram. Bin Laden said on video, "All that we have to do is send 2 mujahideen to the furthest point east to raise a piece of cloth on which is written Al-Qaeda in order to make generals race there, to cause America to suffer human, economic, and political losses without their achieving anything of note other than some benefit for their private corporations." The smug bin Laden bragged in a video testimonial shortly after September 11th, 2001.
Ouch. So in 2001, you were one of those kids with your head shaved waiting in line to go out there and do this.
Absolutely. Right. And you know what? The next one's going to have my kid on it. So I'm not just rattling this stuff off theoretically. This is my son that's going to be getting on that airplane. And a lot of my friends, their sons, because we, let's face it, we keep this stuff in the family. For a lot of warriors, our sons and our daughters go fight. And, so I know we all take this very seriously. I have a lot of blood in this game.
Yeah, literally. So what would your advice to your son be? I mean, besides read your book, because there's a very big dynamic perspective change that has to do with this game changers kind of methodology that you and your colleagues kind of discovered while dealing with the tribes in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about here, go back to the original interview that we did that you'll see linked here, just so you can kind of get a background on the Lieutenant Colonel here. So we get pissed off, we punch back, that feeds the narrative of the haters. Hate begets hate, an eye for an eye, and here we are, spending billions of dollars and sending our boys off to fight wars that we can't win. What then becomes a reasonable solution? What type of reaction do we need to bring forth so that we can cut their recruitment, so that we don't drive more and more disenfranchised kids into the narrative of these haters, and just kind of have a conversation about humanity that shifts this entire thing? I mean, it's just dark.
Yeah, it really is. I think that it's a multi-pronged approach, and it's, the first thing I would suggest to some of your viewers is we're going to have to lead in this effort. I don't believe that America can sit this one out. I think one of the videos you sent me had some interviews with folks from the Ron Paul Foundation and who admittedly are pretty big isolationists in their view on this. And I just don't subscribe to that. I don't think we can sit it out. We're going to have to play a role in leadership. The second thing that I believe is that we are going to have to fight these guys. So I don't want to come across as advocating an approach that is, non-kinetic exclusively, because we are going to have to deal with the irreconcilable elements of this movement, especially at the more senior levels, because they frankly, they can't be turned, and they are going to have to be killed or captured. Now, with that in mind, though, I believe that the broader effort to defeat Islamist violent extremism and the extremists themselves is going to be a range of applications across the entire stability spectrum. I think it starts with what is our story, first of all, as Americans and Westerners and as free citizens of the world. What's our narrative? If Islam is under attack, is that narrative? What is the narrative that we stand for, that we are getting behind? And I have a few ideas on what it should be. However, I believe that it should be a collaborative formation of a narrative that we co-create, and it needs to have the buy-in of the American people, of our allies, and frankly, as many folks as possible in these contentious regions. And that's going to be hard. That's, think about it. I mean, you're talking about, again, cultural clashes here, but I don't think we can ignore that. We have to have a narrative, a central macro level narrative that we can get behind. And so that's a major piece, Pedram. And then the other is, I believe there is a strong precedent in helping locals in these deepest areas of safe haven push back on their own and push these guys out of these areas. I think every place where Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, where they set up shop, there are pragmatic, traditional leaders who don't want them there. And they are the best people suited to fight them and to push them out. And it's not the silver bullet, but it's damn close.
So that to me is compelling, because that's a real grassroots approach. And the question is, how do you empower them? I mean, sure, you can put rifles in the hands of their guys, and then we're back in that type of like arming factions and hoping those arms don't end up in the wrong hands type of thing. And it gets messy. I mean, that's part of the narrative. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of comments to our last video, and a lot of people are like posting stuff about how we armed ISIS by accident or intentionally, and there's a lot of conversation out about that kind of stuff. And so what about the female subjugation in the Islamic world? What about the tribal elders? Like, who are the reasonable voices of the people who just want their children to go to college and have a future? And how do we empower them to take over the narrative away from the haters?
Yeah, right. So a couple of things there that are key. The first thing I will say is that the way that we have armed, for example, the Free Syrian Army, and the way that we've trained them, the way that we've trained some surrogates in Afghanistan, is not the correct way. I'm not an advocate of arming and training a surrogate force and then just turning them loose. I think it is irresponsible, and you get what you pay for when you do that. In my book, I'm very careful to describe the conditions in which we should arm and train locals. And one of the biggest conditions of it is advisors like Green Berets like me should be living in those communities and should go to the rooftops with them when the threat comes, and should stay for as long as it takes. And I absolutely stand behind that. The other thing I will say is arming these locals is not the central solution. It's a component of it. Most of them are already armed. They know these are warrior societies. I promise you, a lot of these folks are armed. Maybe not with state-of-the-art technology that was like in the video you sent, but they're armed. It's more about bolstering them and assisting them to stand on their own, creating space for them to lead. Which gets me to your main question, which is the resilient, what I call resilient leaders. And in my book, I talk about. There's a whole chapter in there as a game changer that is meet them where they are, not where you want them to be. In other words, if we're going to help locals in these safe haven areas deny a safe haven to violent extremists, we have to meet the people that live there where they are. We have to really make an effort to empathize and understand where they live, their macro, micro history, the sources of instability that are causing those areas to be unstable, and how those threads are being pulled by violent extremists, and bring all instruments of power to bear, top down and bottom up, to address those grievances, and more importantly, Pedram, to find the resilient leaders who can address those grievances on their own and create the space for them to do it. Because most of these societies are autonomous, tribal societies that have been degraded and hijacked by violent extremists. And if given the chance, they will stand on their own. They don't necessarily love Americans, but they don't love ISIS either.
Right. So that's really the quagmire, right? Because, America showed up kind of late to the party. We got pretty good at it, especially post-Cold War, and just kind of carving up spheres of influence and putting strongmen in, and, all the things that we needed to kind of, in that narrative stabilize the world. And look, I think they messed up on a lot of things, but, that was then. So a lot of the narrative in that part of the world, in many parts of the world, is that, the West has been subjugating us, the West has been exploiting us. Look at these beautiful cities the West has, and we have nothing. And, and so that is also where this narrative gets hijacked by the extremists and say, I understand your resentment, let's go get them. Right? So how can we empower economically? How can we shift? I mean, is there some sort of apology, right? Is there some sort of conversation that we need to have on a global scale where the West says, yeah, that was kind of messed up, and let's figure out a way to fix that, because the World Bank and the IMF, and there's a lot of vehicles out there that are supposed to be helping bring up poverty lines and help support these countries. But at the end of the day, I mean, they're coming to get low income, whatever menial labor they can in Europe, because where they live, there's no dignity. There's the bread line's too low, right, or too high.
Yeah, the haves and the have-nots, right? I mean, that's always a contributor to instability. And look, I think for one thing, I'm amazed at the number of leaders and policymakers in our country and the West who have absolutely no interest or knowledge in history. And I'm talking about regional and local histories of the places where we're dabbling and where we're going in and operating. And to me, that's inexcusable. If we have politicians in office right now that are putting our folks in combat, and they are spending our blood and treasure for any policy, and they don't have a working knowledge of that area, that's on us as voters. I'm sorry. We put them in there, and that's on us. And as 2016 approaches, I would strongly caution anybody to not do that again. Let's be judicious about who we put in office, and that they will at least value the realities of the places where this is happening. I mean, that's number one, is take the time to actually look at the macro and micro level history of these areas. And here's the other thing. You see these talking heads and these pundits and these analysts who frankly kind of speak down to the American people on all the things that are happening in the region, and it's far too complex for you folks to understand. Let me tell you what's going on. And the reality is, they're only looking at it from one side. They're looking at it from the perspective of the nation state, of that little corrupt government that frankly we probably helped install. And they're not considering any of the tribal or clan realities that govern and determine the outcomes of 80 to 90% of that country. And again, that's inexcusable. We can't do that in this day and age, because I promise you, ISIS and Al Qaeda, they are students of history, and even where they make up their own, they know local history and they work within it. We're going to have to do that. When we establish, you ask if there's an apology. I don't know if it's an apology. I do think there's restoration that needs to happen. Most of these societies are restorative societies. Tribal society is generally restorative. It's based on a relationship that is kept in balance, and when it's out of balance, you go in and you restore it. And I think that probably needs to happen. It starts with our leadership getting real on what's going on in these places and what's been going on, and not trying to project some kind of Jeffersonian democracy on a region that frankly has no use for it, you know,
Or no interest in it.
or no interest. And so, you know, that to me, that's where we start. And I make a strong case for that in the book is, look, let's step back and let's actually look at these regions, how they evolved to where they are, and what's the baseline point of entry here? What's our starting point? And if we just would do that, it could have a huge impact. And that includes the American people too. I think it's a mistake for the American people to sit back and throw stones at what our politicians are doing when we're more worried about what the Kardashians are up to than what's going on in Paris.
Amen. Amen. And then that's not even to mention what happened, you know, almost simultaneously in Beirut with the news of Paris, right?
That's right.
Enormous explosions,
Yep.
lives lost, but you
Yep.
know, they're not Western lives, and that kind of speaks to some of that disconnect and that dissonance too, right? Is
Yep.
a life is a life, where you know when we go over there, it's like we got 10,000 of their guys, we lost 10 of our guys. You know, it's just the math doesn't pencil out the same. And once we can figure out how to value human life across the board, I think that sentiment will start changing. And it's not like saying, you know. There aren't people out there that are combatants that are doing the wrong thing, but it's the attitude that we also need to look at. I mean, we've been following the sentiment cloud on the internet and Facebook on this ever since the story broke, and there's a lot of people pissed off about this, and there's a lot of people from that region that are like, "Hello, Beirut," right? Like that's not fair. Right? And Paris, it's a tragedy. I love Paris. I love everything about Paris. But it's also, Beirut used to be the Paris of the Middle East, very specifically. That's what they called it, right? And now it's just this hellhole where extremism and just these factions are just kind of like killing each other all the time. So, you know, how can we look at addressing that and then the disparity in this media coverage? Because it's also unfair how the media is only covering, like, look what happened to the West, where every single day, and it's the same with Israel. I mean, Israel lives this way, right?
Yeah.
Israel is like constantly wondering when they're going to get attacked next, and that's just kind of their reality. Right. And so, you know, what is that reality like? Well, now the Parisians know. We knew it in New York, and now when it comes close to home, we get pissed off. But you know, anywhere on the planet where this happens, it is all of our problem. And yeah, the Kardashians should just go away.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you know, that was one of the things we were talking about in my circles. Was it was interesting that the attacks on the, you know, primarily on the Shia in Beirut by ISIS almost went unnoticed. And you know, again, there's a lot of media bias to what's going on here. There's plenty of, oh my gosh, there's so much blame to go around for the different administrations. And you know, again, we could do that all day long. The question is, where do we go from here? And I think my first step would be, we really need to dive into what our enemies, violent extremists, what they're after, what they want, what their strategy is. But also, I think we need to get real clear on how they operate, which is, you know, they rely on safe havens across the world where they can plan, inspire, and project from. And in those areas in particular, what's going on there? You know, what's really happening there? And what do we know about it historically? What do we understand in terms of what's destabilizing it really holistically? And what instruments of power from the U.S. and from nonprofits could be applied holistically over the very long term to make those extremists irrelevant, while resilient leaders who once handled their own affairs reassert themselves at a community level and eventually, you know, reconnect to their government in some fashion. I think that's the model, and it scares the hell out of extremists. Anytime we were operating in these dark places where there was local re-empowerment of a resilient leader, you could bet a roadside bomb or an assassination attempt was coming. They cannot deal with moderate voices. They cannot deal with resilient leaders because it renders them irrelevant, Pedram, and they're terrified of irrelevance. They just become thugs at that point.
They need people on the margins because that's where their dialogue lives.
That's right.
So,
exactly right.
So I love this conversation because it's bringing things back to sanity. And Look, there's a lot of opinions out there. Look, I'm not here to have a dog in the race. You fought this fight for a very long time, and you have scar tissue from this very fight. My intent for this is to stoke intelligent conversation across the country and the world, because we are going into an election, and there are certain things that we might need on our end, right? And going into an election year, there are certain factions here that need a bad guy, right? And so I'd like to break that up as well, and really get into a conversation about who the hell we put into office and who represents us and what we can do responsibly as a citizenry that don't want this. Right? You can say most Americans don't want this. Most Parisians don't want this. Most Middle Easterners don't want this. No one wants war. So the people that are driving this and doing this, how do we cut off their funding, and how do we cut off their recruitment? I think we addressed the recruitment. What about funding? Who's writing the checks? Kalashnikovs aren't free, right? And I know they raided a bank in Mosul and got a bunch of money. But how do we cut off the funding to this type of organization?
Yeah, well, I mean, for example, ISIS is selling oil on the black market in a very lucrative fashion. And I think, in the video that you sent me, one of the things that I think they made a valid point on the Truth TV or whatever that was called was, why aren't we isolating the banks, that are playing? I agree. Look, I think when it comes to the funding of these terror groups, we are pretty darn good at tracing the path of money from point of origin to point of expenditure. And we know how these guys are making their money. And some of it is greasing institutional pockets. And in where that is happening, man, we need to, that's got to stop.
Yeah.
That's got to stop. That's inexcusable. And there's no justification of it at any nation state level. I'm sorry. There's just not.
Well, that's like, let's draw a line around that right now real quick, because I think that's a very powerful, compelling statement that you just made, is aiding and abetting a terrorist organization by allowing them to receive funds is treason, and I think also terrorism. And so I'd like to know the organizations that are doing that. I'd like to know who's letting that happen, because that seems like a no-brainer place to look. Because there's money to be made, and there's probably some really dirty hands that are a little higher up on the food chain that are involved in that, and that seems like an obvious place that the media hasn't really been looking. So how do we stoke that fire?
Well, for example, who is ISIS selling the oil to? I mean, there's a lot of overt reporting that says it's to Turkey. Well, aren't they in NATO?
Right.
Okay. I also know that there's a lot of donor support that comes from Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other places that are donating to the Wahhabists and other extremists. I think we got to be honest about that and call that out.
And so just to put those together, the Wahhabists and the other extremists are also somehow affiliated with ISIS. So is ISIS getting this oil buck, or is this money landing in their lap from the Saudi and the UAE coffers?
Oh, well, there's donors from all over the world, that are donating to ISIS and other extremist groups. And frankly, a lot of your international groups, Pedram, they're competing and vying for donor support. I think you see ISIS and Al Qaeda a lot of times in competition for who's the most relevant block, to get that donor check. It is a business, and demonstrating that you're the most relevant, competent terror group and that you are the advocate of that ideology in the most compelling way means that you're going to probably get the fattest checks. So there's donor support from all over the world. The U.S. has put pressure on a lot of these financing actions. I mean, that was an arena I didn't work directly in, but I got to see a lot of that work. So I don't want to come across as if we're not combating the financial arm of it. We are, but I do think also that there's some areas that we could do better.
Yep. Have we identified who some of these donors are? I mean, I'm assuming they're not nation states because that would be, that's war. But I mean, have we identified who they are and what their interest in this is? I mean, are we talking, people interested in selling armaments? Are we talking about people that are just wanting to make a quick buck on the black market in cheaper oil? Who are these people that are paying for the party? Because I think follow the money is a pretty good direction to go in any investigation, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of folks in, for example, Saudi Arabia that, and can I lay out the proof like on the Skype? No, but my inclination is there's a lot of wealthy families in Saudi Arabia and other countries that are actively donating to, violent extremist causes that are in pretty good standing with the West. And it's there. There's also there's a bit of duplicity in that, but there's also speculation that, for example, in Saudi Arabia, just keeping exporting Wahhabism outside of Saudi Arabia keeps it from manifesting inside their own borders. So there is a degree of duplicity in this. It's very complex, but the donor piece is very active. There are donors all over the world that are donating to this cause, but ISIS also generates its own revenue through oil and arms and other things.
Yeah. So I mean, it seems like a no-brainer to go after anyone who buys their oil and cut that off. It seems like a no-brainer to go after anyone who's writing those checks and isolate them. And so, I mean, look, this isn't. We're not going to come up with all these answers here in our interview, but these are a lot of the questions that come up, and we've had a lot of people come up in the chat threads for our last video, bringing up these types of points. And look, they're all valid. Right? Follow the money and follow the sentiment and figure out who the hell is interested in picking this fight and basically sponsoring the foot soldiers who are out there killing innocent lives. I mean, that's uncool, and we're not going to stand for it. But what do the good people of the world need to do to elevate above this narrative and go to one that is much more inclusive, that allows for a lasting, sustainable peace? Because what's happening now, I mean, look, France is doing exactly what we did in 2001.
Yep, exactly. And this is what ISIS counts on. This is what they want. Like when I read you that bin Laden quote, they know that our response will be emotional. And don't forget that ISIS and these other groups, especially ISIS, they really believe they will usher in the apocalypse. They really believe that the set piece battle in Syria will take place, the prophet will return, and the righteous will be returned to heaven, and that this judgment day event will happen. And they want a response from the West, from the crusader, from the infidel. They are not afraid of a response. They want a response. And so we have to be mindful of how we respond. It's not if we respond. We have to respond. We have to lead. We have to protect our people at home. But at the same time, we also have to be honest and look at ourselves and go, okay, what's really going on here at a global narrative level? How are we feeding it, and making ourselves more at risk? And, after almost 15 years of this war, 3 times longer than World War II, I'm sorry, I'm going to call out some of the, just cyclical things that we're doing that are putting our nation more at risk. And this type of response is a big one, where we just respond with air power, large troop formations to what? Hand out soccer balls and dig wells, when we become the occupier and feed that narrative. And this thing, we were spending, I don't know if we talked about this on the last interview, Pedram, according to Antonio Gistosi, in 2005, the coalition was spending $16 million for every Taliban it killed on the Afghan battlefield, and that is unbelievable. You might make the argument that's the cost of doing business if you win, but considering the Taliban recently seized the capital of Kunduz and we're just months from pulling out, that's not a good return on investment. We can't sustain that.
Yeah, that's, look, the methodology, there's a couple arguments in there. One is it's great for an arms dealer. It's really great for, someone who wants to destabilize the region and keep things going, but it's terrible for humanity. right? It is an absolute atrocious number, and what we're talking about is putting investment capital dollar value on a human life. And although it's a combatant, what does $16 million buy in Afghanistan? We're talking
Yeah,
about
exactly.
a school, a hospital, an upgraded farm, an aqueduct. I mean, things that would actually bring abundance to the village and help them. You know, who the hell wants to go blow themselves up if life is good, right? And so that conversation, the Peace Corps conversation, going side by side with kind of protection and all that, I find that to be really compelling. I have a friend, John Rose, who used to go and do water treatment, water reclamation, and he'd ride up with your guys and go to these villages and just help them get clean water, and they were so thankful. They were so happy to have access to things that are just kind of basic human needs that they'd been deprived of.
And I think a big chunk of that is still very valid, still very viable, and the only caution I would add, what I think we need to do more of, is before we go into those places and do those things, whether it's a nonprofit or a security force or a combination thereof. I think we need to be as clear as we can on what the local realities of that area are, and who the resilient leaders are, and what the resilient leaders think they need. Because what we started to do in Afghanistan that was almost as diabolical as the application of, security forces was the application of economic aid or development charity that made us feel good, but it actually created an entitlement culture that will plague Afghanistan and Iraq for decades. These are very proud tribal areas that have functioned, throughout history as autonomous communities that handled their own shit. They didn't need their own government to provide for them, much less some Western government to come in and dole out development charity. These are resilient, tough people, but our actions actually helped create an entitlement culture in a tribal society. And to me, there's nothing worse than that. Because, where do you go from there?
Well, there's this cry right now saying that we need a global Marshall Plan. And for our listeners who are listening, the Marshall Plan was after World War II. We'd firebombed all these towns, and the whole shit show had come apart. And so we as America in a leadership position thought that it would be appropriate to reinvest and rebuild Western Europe, and then use that as kind of a moniker for peace and stability. And to a certain extent, I mean, many would argue that it was a very successful program, and it really created kind of the economic prosperity that's kept us in relative peace, if you will, since World War II. And so what would that look like for tribal regions? What would an economic aid and development program in your mind look like that would actually be supportive of the tribal dynamics in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Yeah, so I talk about that a good bit in the book. I think it would look a lot like the Village Stability Program that we were running in Afghanistan, where you had essentially a handful of special forces advisors working very closely with the special forces of that country. You had, USAID and the foreign minister or the ministries of that country all combined, working top down and bottom up. And I think what it starts with is this, and this is what I would, we can replicate this anywhere. What does relative stability and what did it look like in the areas that we're talking about? So, for example, in Afghanistan, what did relative stability even look like in the more modern, stable periods of that country's history, which was, by the way, 1923 to 1972. The Musahiban dynasty, about 80% of the country was tribal. The king had a very little reach into the rural areas. Security would project in and out. People normally handled their own affairs. It was grassroots, bottom up, dispute resolution kind of stuff. Start with that. What did it look like? What were the actual functioning systems in place? And then work with the resilient leaders and the ministries of that country to at least start there. Maybe you can't recreate it, but at least start with an informed perspective of what relative stability looked like there. And that way we won't find ourselves doing development charity that isn't even in step with that resilient tribal society. In other words, it doesn't do any good to go in and build a school if the elders of that village don't want it. You know, I mean, they may feel like what they need is more civic space to conduct dispute resolution between two warring tribal factions, because they know that a school's not going to do any good until those tribes stop shooting at each other.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's a very bottom up approach, where we open our ears, talk less, listen more, and work with the resilient leaders of these areas and follow their lead. Not easy to do, but look, America, there is a lot of good in this country, and I am a big believer in our people and our leadership, and in our ability to go into these dark places and help locals stand on their own again and eventually connect to their government in a way that's locally appropriate and sustainable. Yes, I believe we can do it. I believe we have done it. We just need to look at where we've been successful and where we haven't.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. And that leadership role is ours to step into, or we're going to cower and have, military on every city block protecting us from some crazy that might go into the mall.
Yeah, that's right. And, I'll just tell you, my opinion is the leadership we have right now on both sides of the aisle, they're not going to get it done. They're not the guys and gals that are going to lead us out of this problem. And my challenge to everyone watching this, we can debate the politics all day long and who we think started this, but, can we at least agree that, Islamist violent extremism is a major threat facing the world, civil society, and our country. And the folks that we have in office starting in 2016, we as Americans really need to look hard at who we put in there. And some of the things we've talked about on this show, are they going to take this seriously? Are they going to consider local realities and maybe open their minds to a different approach? And if not, I don't think they should be in office.
Yeah, so that speaks to a problem I think everyone's having in America, which is, I don't know who the hell to vote for. All these monkeys are the same. That kind of sentiment, right? Which is, it's a lesser of evils argument, and they all kind of do the same thing. And that is a very big challenge with people feeling marginalized in a democratic society. And it seems like the sociopaths bubble to the top. So what can we do here to step in and kind of take it? It's like this country was predicated on a democracy that worked on an enlightened citizenry. What's going on, you're involved in the politics. If someone isn't representing your view, you don't vote them in. And now it seems like, let the Kardashians and Dancing with the Stars take your attention, and they just do what they do. That's a problem.
Yeah, it is. And, it's unfortunately, a lot of times it's a lesser of two evils. Looks like there's no good choices. And, and I get that. I guess it depends on where you view this issue of violent extremism. Like, where do you rack and stack it in the things facing the nation? If you think that global warming is a much greater threat, then what I'm saying may not hold any water. But if you do believe that Islamist violent extremism is indeed a threat of our time, and that we're going to have to really take this on, then I would start by looking at political officials who understand and demonstrate knowledge of not only these violent extremist groups, but the regions that they hail from, and that they have an informed point of view and an open mind. And if they don't, if their response is, I would go bomb the bastards, I'm not voting for them, man. I'm just not, because they're not any better than the folks that stick their head in the sand. Yeah. Both of them are inherently dangerous to our country. I want a leader who recognizes the complexity of this problem, who has an open mind, and is willing to lead, but also to follow. And I think they're out there. I can't give up on that, Pedram, because I have 3 boys that I'm turning this country over to that are counting on me to give it to them better than I found it. And I just don't accept the fact that we don't have any leaders left.
Yeah. Well, when we are standing around wondering who the leaders are that we can support and we don't see any, maybe it's time for us to step up. So I don't know, man. Maybe you have a political career ahead of you, because it's hard. If you're the last man standing, then you might need to step in. That's where leadership comes from, the reluctant leadership of the person who understands that it's not black or white, it's gray, and it's a complex world, and that's the world we're handing to our children. Look, I got a 2-week-old baby. Like, I'm feeling it, right? The world is a scarier place that she just stepped into than I did, right? Yeah. And that's happening on my watch, and so I have to do something about that, as do you. So, I think maybe that's also it, is bringing more people into our political process, taking the corporate money out of our politics, and really taking back, because if we're talking about this narrative of society of contract, and the democratic principles that we stand for, that we've been trying to wholesale export, and then you look at the foundations of our democratic society, realizing that the voter turnout sucks and people don't care, and we got a bunch of sociopaths kind of like taking money from big oil running the show. Well, that's not necessarily an exportable narrative either. So we better clean up our own democracy and figure it out, so that we can step into a leadership role. And if you don't have anyone that you can support as a leader, then maybe you need to step up. And I'm saying that to everyone out there.
Yeah, no, it's right. And, again, I think when you look closer at the political scene, there are people in the scene that aren't necessarily bad choices. I think we're so disengaged. It's like we've kind of given up on the whole process, and we're just going to focus on other things and hope it doesn't come home to roost. But you know what? It's going to come home to roost. You mark my words. What happened in Paris is going to come our way if we don't start paying attention. And I just don't want that for my kids, and I don't want that for our country. And more important, what I'm more afraid of than that is the response that we'll have to it and where we'll go from there. That worries me more than anything.
Yeah. Just as a final note, there's this piece that I got to weave together here, which is either you think global warming is the main issue or terrorism is the main issue, and that perspective, I think, is also starting to crumble, because we start looking at the data on global warming and climate change. We're really realizing that the climate change has driven many of the agrarian people in Syria and Iraq into destitute poverty, according to some of the, there has actually been a shift. And that shift is affecting people's livelihood, and that's also creating people that are much more willing to get marginalized, because they no longer have a livelihood, and then they can join these kind of extremist narratives. So it's an interesting time where all of these things are coming together, and so there isn't an either or. There needs to be a comprehensive conversation that isn't so polarized, and that's just the way it is. That's how civic society has to function, is dialogue.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And here we are, we're talking. And so anyone who's listening to this, understand that this isn't about positing an answer, but this is about driving a conversation that needs to happen in every household, in every town, in the West and globally, so that we can actually all kind of step in and be a part of a solution. So, Lieutenant Colonel Mann, I really appreciate the work that you're doing. You're fighting the good fight, and you're doing it for your children and their children, and I truly see that. And so it ain't easy. It ain't easy to do what you're doing. So thank you, and let's just keep it going. And I want to reiterate from our first interview here, the book that you wrote, Game Changers, and we'll give out the URL in a second. The intent is to drive those sales to be a fundraiser to get this narrative in the hands of more people. And so you don't make any money off this book. It's about helping change the conversation, and I really admire what you're doing there. So share the URL. We'll put it in the blog post, but share the URL again, please, so people can read your book.
Yeah, thanks, Pedram. It's The Game Changers, plural, thegamechangersbook.com. And if you go there, you can order a hard copy. You can order it online, from Amazon, all from that one site. And if you want multiple copies, just send me a note, and we'll get you multiple copies. But, it's all the proceeds go back to our warriors and law enforcement who are frankly on the front lines of this thing.
Excellent. And I know you're at Fort Bragg today, training these young guys about the wisdom that you gathered, so they could run in there and kind of do things differently. So you're out there, you're doing it. So thank you. Thanks for kind of sharing the wisdom so that we can stop the insanity and really, let's make this about peace. Let's make this about dialogue, and you're doing it. So thanks for being on the show.
Thanks a lot,
again.
Pedro. Appreciate it. My pleasure. Thank you.
Like I said, he brought it. Look, this is a complicated topic. It is not easy. We're not going to come up with all the answers here. The point is to start intelligent dialogue and keep it going. So I hope you enjoyed it. Give me comments in the threads. Let me know what you think, and check out the new site, theurbanmonk.com. I got all sorts of good stuff over there for you, and I enjoy doing this for you. Let me know how you're enjoying it back. I'll see you in the next show.